You're good. Thank you. Okay. I want to start by giving a big thank you for everybody who organized these chaburas. They put a lot of effort into it. And I know for a fact that the person who organizes the chabura is working very hard to find other people to give these chaburas. So just a plug for if anybody's interested in giving in the future. If you could reach out to me, I might know how to connect you with the people who can set you up how to give this chabura. So today I want to focus on an inyan that comes up at the beginning of Cheskas and across Shas. That's the inyan of Kol Dalam Gvar. The Gemara says, Ze Omer Shel Avosai, Ze Omer Shel Avosai, Omer of Nachman, Kol Dalam Gvar. The Gemara in Bava Basra Daled Beis says that there's a case where Ze Omer Shel Avosai and Ze Omer Shel Avosai, each person has Edi Avos, and the halacha is Kol Dalam Gvar. There's a chakira that's brought up in the Achronim of what exactly is the nature of Kol Dalam Gvar. Is Kol Dalam Gvar a siluk or is it a din? We'll hopefully over the next little bit of time try to understand what these two things mean, and in particular try to figure out what's the Shitas Harash in understanding Kol Dalam Gvar. To start with a simple understanding of what these two ideas are, Kol Dalam Gvar is in theory a birur misafek. We have a case where we have no idea how to be machriya who the karka in this case belongs to. Does it belong to the first guy who brings Edi Avos or the second guy who brings Edi Avos? So we say called Olam Gvar. In terms of the tzad of siluk, what that would mean is that the way that Bezdin acts in this suffix is that they pull themselves back from the case and let the two people fight it out, and whoever gets the karka gets the karka. If you say that it's a din, the implication of that would mean that it's based on svaros. We're going to see in a little bit what the svaros are. Let's start by seeing the Rush in the back of our Masechta. It's in Siman Chaf Beis. The Rush says as follows: Ze Omer Shel Avosai, Ze Omer Shel Avosai, Amar Rav Nachman called Olam Gvar. So a quote from our Gemara. Hi called Olam Gvar dinahu. Called Olam Gvar is a din. The kol mi shegavar yado b'pam rishona hu shalo ad sheyavi chaveiro raya. That the first person who gets the karka, he gets to keep it until another person comes and brings a raya. The kol's man shelo yavi raya, kol's man, he hasn't brought a raya. Af im tigbar yado lo shavkinan leila fuki minei. Even if the second guy comes and is toifes the karka from him, we don't allow him to take it. The first guy who gets the karka gets to keep it. The lo mistaber sheyitkenu chachamim sheyiyu kol yemeim bim rivo machlekes hayomi gaber zeh umacher chavero. It's not mistaber. It doesn't make sense that the chachamim would say that one day the karka should go to this guy and one day the karka should go to the other guy if he gets it. It doesn't make any sense that they should live their entire lives in this fashion. Rather, el chacham pasku kol dalam gvar b'pam hazos gavar v'samchu. We'll get there in a second. That the chacham pasku kol dalam gvar, whoever gets it the first time, end of story. V'samchu hazet the kol misha dinimo karav lahavi rayos. The chacham were somich on that anybody who has the correct tzad of the halacha on his side will be able to bring a rayos v'od misha dinimo yimser nafsho lahamid shelo biyado. If he's correct, he will put more effort into getting the field. He'll put in more effort than the person who will come to steal. Ve'od, additionally, the person who knows that the halacha is not with him, Yomar, he'll say, why should I put in so much effort now, and it'll come out at a later point that this guy will bring Edim and I'll lose my chazaka. Now, it seems glaring from this siman in the Rush that the Rush holds that Kol Dalam Gvar is a din with svaras, Ad kidei kach, then it makes a muchzak. There's a machlokes in the Rishonim. If a person's toves out called olam gvar, do we say that I can grab it back and forth, or the first person who grabs it gets a muchzakus, and the only way to be motzi is either with a raya that you bought it from him or edei marakama. Those are another two levels in the Rishonim. If edei marakama works, or you need also edei marakama is not enough. You need edim that you bought the karka from him. If you want, you can see the Mukhi Yosef on Lamed Aleph says that second side. But what definitely comes out from this Rosh, Lechora, is that he holds that called Olam Gvar is a din. Ad kidei kach, that he says almost first in the first line, called Olam Gvar dinahu. And he goes on to say svaros. We get a little bit problematic when we see the Rosh in Tshuva. The Rosh in Tshuva in Klal Ayin Zayin has a lashon that seems very clearly not like that. The Rosh is Shaila. Someone wrote to the Rosh, what's the halacha in Kol Olam Gvar? When I get something else called Olam Gvar, can the other Baldin make me take a shvua that I got it correctly? Pashtus is, in a regular case where Bezdin makes someone win, so he doesn't have to take a shvua because Bezdin gave him the karka. However, when we're still in the phase of tainas, if it's not a clear psak Bezdin, then you should have to take a shvua. So it would follow that you have to take a shvua if called Olam Gvar is a siluk because you don't have a clear psak of Bezdin. But if called Olam Gvar is actually a psak Bezdin with svaras and umdanas and everything going in the direction of the person who actually got the karka, got it kiddin, in that case, you should not have to take a shvua. So let's see what the Rosh has to say. We'll start a little bit into his response. He says, Kol Olam Gvar v'gover yad ha'echad v'tafas shekenegdo yachal lehashbiyah. One guy grabs it. The halacha, says the Rosh, is that the other guy is able to be mashbiyah him. Shebedin tafas. That he has to take a shvur that he got it halachically in a mutter way, that it actually belonged to him. And here's the kicker. V'had depaskinan kol olam gvar. That which the Bezdin says, called Olam Gvar, lav dinahu, is not a din. Bezdin just removes themselves. Additionally, he says in another line, Dematzi lameimar Bezdin paskuli called Olam Gvar, v'gaver yadi v'zachisim b'koach Bezdin. And then he says, V'ein li shava, I don't have to take a shvua, ella machmas she'ein Bezdin yecholim levarer shal mihu. Bezdin is not able to be mevarer who it belongs to. These two things seem to indicate that it's a siluk. And if that wasn't enough for you, later in the same tshuva, the Rosh writes, V'ginai lebezdin sheyifseku shuda o chaluka v'yitztarchu lahachzir. We know that the Gemara in the Hemshich on Daf Lamed Hey is mechalik between the case of Shnei Shtaros and the case of Kol Olam Gvar. That by Shnei Shtaros we say shuda or Yachloku, that's Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. And by us, we say Kol Olam Gvar. So what's the chiluk, says the Gemara? In the case of Shnei Shtaros, so that's a case of Leka Lameka Malad Milsa. However, by the case of Kol Olam Gvar, that's Ika Lameka Malad Milsa. And since it's Ika Lameka Malad Milsa, says the Rosh, Nistalku Chachamim Min Adin Ve'amru Kol Olam Gvar. Since there was going to be a possibility that at a later point, Adam could come and be Mavar the Suffolk, if the Chacham say a psak, then it's going to look very bad for them if they have to be choser on the psak that they made. Therefore, says the Rosh, we say the Chacham take themselves back, they're misalik themselves min adin, and therefore the resulting case is called Olam Gvar. And the question begs itself. We saw the Rosh in Halachos and Bava Basra says in Sibin Chaf Beis that called Olam Gvar is a din based on Svaros. But at the same time, we saw the Rosh and Shuva in Klal Ayin Zayin seem to be almost mefurish that it is in fact a siluk. So to answer this apparent stira, I think we have to see the Rosh and Halachos more carefully. The Rosh and Halachos says as follows. We'll read the first line again carefully. The Rosh says, Hai kol olam gvar dinahu. Kol Olam Gvar is a din. But he doesn't stop there. In theory, if we wanted to say that the Rosh was speaking at large about Kol Olam Gvar and calling it a din based on Svaros, he should have said, Hi Kol Olam Gvar, dinahu, comma, vi kol mi shegavar yado b'pam rishona hu shelo. there are two separate halachas that you would be teaching in that case. The first halacha would be that kol dalam gvar, the way it works is a din. And the second thing you'd be teaching is that it works like a din, that the first guy gets a muhsa. And the second guy who tovis from it, we take it away from him. However, he doesn't say that. He uses a dalid as opposed to a vav. We know that a dalid is a connector. It's explaining the reason behind the halacha. So how does it read? Hi called al gvar dinahu de kol mishigavar yadu b'pam rishona hu shalo. What the Rush is saying in halachos is that in the case of kol de alim gvar, the halacha is that mishigavar yado pam rishona, it belongs to him. So what's with all the svaras that follow? If we're going to say right now, what we want to say is that the ikr lashon of the Rosh is the Russian Shuva. And the Russian Shuva is saying it's a siluk. And what's the Russian halacha saying? The Russian halacha is just saying it's true that it's a siluk. But even though it's a siluk, it's going to come out that the first guy gets a muhsa. If it's a siluk, why should the first guy get the muhsa? We only say, if there's a svara to say that it's his. If there's a tzad to say he bought it, v'chule, v'chule. So why would we say it's his there? We know exactly how he got it. He was typhus out of the suffix of kol dalam gvar. There's no birur here whatsoever. So what does the Rush have to come and say? The Rush says it's true that there are these svaros, but those svaros are not enough or necessary for Bezdin to a siluk misafik. Bezdin steps back and they let the case play itself out. However, once one person gets it, they allow him to keep it because of the svaros, that the person of who has the right din on his side will be moser atzmo more than the other guy. That's part one. The difficulty is there's another stira, a similar stira. The Rush in Tosa Rush in Bava Metzia asks a question that we're going to revisit hopefully towards the end of the chabura that Tosos here asks. Previously, before we got into the case of Rav Nachman, the Gemara in Bava Basra and Down Abayis had another case, the case of Hahu Arba. There was a boat, neither party was tofes in the boat, no mochsak. And the Gemara Paskins, in that case, we would say, called Alim Gvar. The Gemara, Tosos the Rishonim ask, not the Gemara, Tosos and the other Rishonim ask, why is this case different than Shnayim Eichsen, where we say Achloku as opposed to called Alim Gvar? So Tosos Harash in Bava Metzia deals with this issue, and he says two Lishonos. We're not going to focus for now on the answer that he says, but when he speaks about the case of Kol Da'olam Gvar, it's indicative of how he learns the mechanics of the case. He says, V'chein zeh omer shelav osai. Ein lanu limchos l'kol haba likach bechazaka davar she'ein anu yodim shel mihu. In the case of zeh omer shelav osai, we cannot object to a person coming to take something if we don't know who it belongs to. Hilkach ein anu mishtadlim lifsok hadin beinayim yachloku. Bezdin does not put in effort. They do not get involved in paskening the shaila. Shema nafsid le'echad mehem. Because maybe al yedei the psak of Bezdin, one person will lose out. That clearly seems to say, ein anu mishtadlim lifsok, means we step back and let the case play out. Kol Da'olam Gvar is not Bezdin actively trying to be mevarer who the boat or the karka actually belongs to. Rather, it's that they take a step back and let the case play out. The problem is, in another line, the Rush has, again, L'shonis that are mashma the other way. He says, Elo omrim lahem, kol mi shetiskaber yado b'rayoso b'kawach yizke, v'somchin al zeh shemisha denimo karav hu lahavi rayos. We say that a person who's misgaber yado, either b'rayos or b'kawach, is zoche, and they're somech on misha hadin imo, is karavu lavi rayos. That lashon of yizke sounds a lot like he's actually getting a zechus in the karka, which means that would lechora be a psak. And at the same time, right after that, the Rush says, Shemisha Denimo Karvu Lavi Rayas. And he goes into the whole spiel, like we were saying in halachos, of the svaras. So again, you see the same steer in the Rush. The Rush says, on the one hand, in the first line, that Bezdin is not mishtadlin to paskin, but at the same time, he uses a lashon of yizke. and use a lashon of mishad din imo karvu lahavi rayos. That sounds like svaras. That sounds like a psak. What are we going to do to resolve the stira? A mahalach that came up in resolving this was maybe we could say as follows. We're going to see in a second why this won't work. But let's say that it's a siluk. Bezdin is going to remove themselves from the case. And it's true that they don't actually think that bevadai, the person who gets it, is the one who actually owns the boat. Rather, there needs to be some degree of histabros that the person who is going to get the boat will get it. Not that it's a neutral slate, that, we're just going to let the case play itself out. It's certainly not enough for Bezdin to actively give the guy who's going to put in more effort the boat, but they're allowed to misalik themselves because of those svaros. The problem is that doesn't work either because it's mafurish against the lashon of the Rosh. The Rosh says at the beginning of the line that we were just reading in Tosa Rosh Bava Metzia, he says, Ein lanu limchos lekol haba likach bechazaka davar she'ein anu yodim shel mihu. We should not object to let someone take bechazaka something that we do not know who it belongs to. Hilkach ein anu mishtadlim l'sok hadin beinayam yachloku shema nafsid la'echad mehem. It's clear from that lashon of the Rosh that the only case that Bezdin is not able to be misalik themselves is if they know that bifneim there's a vadai ma'aseh gzela. If there's not bifneim vadai ma'aseh gzela, then no problem. That undoes our mahalach. It's not possible to say that it's a siluk that's based on a histabros, because you don't need that histabros to be misalik yourself according to the Rosh. It also comes out in what we're saying that the sugya on lamed gimel lamed beis of the Paris Yeradativ, that case is where I go and take fruit from a person's field. We know that the field belongs to the other person. However, I am eating the fruit. There's a chazaka of lo chatzif inish lemechal Paris de lavdidei. There's a chazaka that a person won't be brazen enough to go into someone else's field and eat pears that are not his. Therefore, if I come into the field, at least according to some Rishonim, and eat the fruits, and I say, I know that this field belongs to the other guy, however, I have the rights to the peiros, and the other guy is not around to stop me, Bezdin will sit back and watch as I eat the fruits. Now, l'chora, one might ask, I don't understand. We just said, according to the Rosh, that all you need in order to be misalik yourselves is to know that there's not a vadai ma'aseh gzela here, not a histabros, a reason to think that the guy who's taking the karka or the metaltalin is getting it kidin. So what does the Gemara Lamed Gimel have to come onto the svara of lo chatzif inish for? L'chor, that's unnecessary. All they need to know is that the metaltalin, the fruits, are not being taken of vadei ma'aseh gzela. So l'chora, the pasha chiluk is like this. There's a muchsak in the peiros. In our case, in Kol Dal Mgvar, we know there's no muchsak. So when there's no muchsak, you could just back yourself out right away without any other svaras. But in the case of the Paris Yeradativ, there you taka need to come on to svaras because the other guy's a muchsak. So to take from a muchsak is a vadei ma'aseh gzela unless you have a svara. Once you have a svara, that negates the muchzakos, and therefore you come out neutral, and Bezdin's able to be misalik themselves. That's what we're holding now. Additionally, that mahalach of saying that Bezdin is misalik themselves only when there's a histabris is not viable because it doesn't explain the lashon of zocha in the Tosa Rosh. We had two problems. We said, number one, why does Tosa Rosh need svarus if he holds it to siluk? And why does he use the lashon of zocha, which sounds like he's actually getting the karka? So we say as follows. This lashon in Tosa Rosh, I think, can be answered up. I'll pee the things that we were saying before in the stira between the Rosh and Shuva and the Rosh and Halachos. What did we say to answer the stira and Rosh and Halachos and the Rosh and Shuva? That really Kol Dal Gvar is a siluk. So why do we do all this mentioning of svaros? The svaros are to tell us explain the seemingly odd halacha in the Rush, that even though we say it's a siluk, the first guy who's tofes gets a muchzak. What do you mean he gets a muchzak? It's a siluk. He has no svaras. No, Hitak has svaras. The svaras are not enough to call it a psak. It's still us pulling back. However, once he gets it, he has svaros on his side. The shaila becomes a little bit more difficult. Everything that we just mentioned up until this point in the Rush leads us to believe that even when one person gets the metaltalin or the karka out of a kol d'olam gvar, we should take it away from him. We should not take it away from him. However, the Rush says we do take it away from him. Why should we not take it away from him? Well, we know the Rush in Tusa Rush in Bava Metzia writes the only case that Bezdin has to get involved is when they see a vade ma'aseh gzela in front of them. We know that via the action of kol d'olam gvar, the first person is tafos. That we know for sure. The second guy is taking it from him out of a kol d'olam gvar. To say that's a vade ma'aseh gzela and therefore Bezdin has to get involved, even with the svaras, to say that the first guy is muchzak kiddin, because Moser atzmot tfei and all the other svaras you want to say, we can't say that classifies as a vade ma'aseh gzela. Why would Bezdin get involved at that step? According to Mahalach, we developed into Sarash. So I think you have to say, be mitzarif another svara that we saw in the Tosarash. In the Russian halachos. The Russian halachos in Baba Basra says that kol d'olam gvar, the reason we don't go back and forth between muchzaks is both because of the svaras that we mentioned, and he adds one more line. The line that he says is, there are two factors that it's Bezdin's responsibility to make sure are upheld. The first is that vade ma'aseh gzela does not happen in front of their eyes and they just sit back and watch. And the second is that there has to be a normal society. It's the responsibility of the Bezdin, the governing body of Klal Yisrael, to make sure that people can live normal lives. We see that if people were to be able to go out of a kol d'olam gvar and grab karka back and forth from one another, that would prevent the ability for people to live normal lives. So it's true that in terms of the ikar hadin of kol d'olam gvar and the ikar hadin of the responsibilities of Bezdin, they're not chayiv to take the karka or the metaltalin from the second guy who's tofes out of the kol d'olam gvar from the other guy, because it's not a vade ma'aseh gzela. However, out the histabros that Bezdin is not going to allow people to go back and forth b'meriva, that's why they say that the first person who gets it, he has the svaras on his side of Moser atzmot tfei, and therefore we leave the karka by him. And anybody who comes to take it from him, Bezdin won't allow that, because that negates their other responsibility to make sure that people could live normal, functioning lives. I think that al pi this mahalach, we can answer a kasha that's brought in Rav Elchanan. Rav Elchanan in Kovitz Shiurim in Siman Kuf Nun Beis, we'll read it together. It seems to me that the Rav Elchanan didn't have the Shus Rush. It seems to be that way. We'll see why in a second, but that's going to be the easiest way to answer one of his questions. The Rav Elchanan comes out with the following question. He says, Behad de kol d'olam gvar. In the halacha of kol d'olam gvar, Pirish Rashbam, the Rashbam says, the ein Bezdin is kalkin lahen klal. The Rashbam, on Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, clearly says that kol d'olam gvar is a siluk. Bezdin steps back, lets the case play itself out. Ulefi zeh, and according to this, L'olam mahanya tfisa b'zachar zeh. Tfisa b'zachar zeh will always work. Aval harosh kasav, d'lo mistaber hachi, d'lo mani tfisa sheni. The Rush writes that this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that the tfisa hasheni should work. V'das Tosas besugi d'takfa koin kershpam, in the sugi of takfa koin, Tosas like kershpam. Ulish pir shpam asi shapir had mishani hacha ikol mekem alad milsa, mishabachi bezin misalkin atzbar. In the case of ikol mekem alad milsa, the Rashbam comes out making a lot of sense because we're concerned about a Genai Bezdin, and therefore Bezdin is just misalik themselves. Kimavur Perusha. Avaladas Rosh, but according to the Rosh, the Bezdin ain't misalkin atzman. Bezdin does not do a siluk. We know it's clear from the Russian Shuva that we seem to say not like that. Elash is somchin al umdina. Rather, they rely on the umdina kimishu shalo yigaver, that the one who actually owns the davar will come out stronger and take the thing. L'chayra ma bekach the ikalamekam molo. Who cares if ikalamekam or not? Im umdina tovahi. If it's a good umdina. Heichad ikalamekam. Lamelo nismo chazeh. Gam heichad delekalamekam. If the Rosh holds that we're talking about a svara here, it's an umdana that's enough for us to give the moment to one person. So why should we be mechalik between ikal meikam aladimosa and lekal meikam aladimosa? Give it to one person in ikal meikam aladimosa, the same way you gave it to one person. It's a real psak in ikal meikam aladimosa as well, just like you did in lekka. So we have to deal with 2 points here. The first is the easier point. Rav Elchanan is coming off a hanacha that the Rosh holds that called Olam Gvar is a psak based on svaras. Up until now, we seem to have proven, mostly based on the Russian Shuva, that the Rosh can't hold that. That answers question number 1. Part 1 of the answer is going to be that the Rosh actually holds called Olam Gvar is not a psak, it's a siluk. Okay, now that it's a siluk, we have to figure something out. It's a siluk, and that makes a lot of sense why we say called Olam Gvar in a case of Ikala Meikam Aladim Milsa, because we're afraid of an evil bezdin like Lashon Rishbam. But the Rav Elchanan's question is still shaykh in the case of Leka Meikam Aladim Milsa. In the case of Leka Meikam Aladim Milsa, why don't we do a siluk there as well? You might be thinking to yourself, well, if we have a choice of making a psak of, let's say, achloku or shuda, so why would I all of a sudden decide to take a different route and say that we're going to do a siluk? So it's not so pasha. We see from that it's not so pasha from Tosfos. Tosfos we mentioned before, in Dibra Maskal Hahu Arba, Alamid Dawud Amid Beis. He asks the question that we mentioned. Tosfos Rosh asks. He asks, what's the difference between what we said over here by Ahu Arba, that we're going to say called Olam Gvar, and the case of Shnaim Ochsen in Bava Metzia, where we don't say called Olam Gvar, rather we say Yachloku. What drives at this difference? Tosfos' answer is really a chabur in its own right, but we'll just be medayik something from his teretz. He says, Mefarish Rabbeinu Tam. Salam Dalam Abez is 3 lines in. Mefarish Rabbeinu Tam. The Ochsen shiny. Rabbeinu Tam explains that the case of Ochsen in the beginning of Bava Metzia is different. The Kevat Shneim Muchzakin, since they're both Muchzak, Ein Lanu Laniach Sheyigzah Echad Lechaveru. Since the 2 people are Muchzak, we won't allow one person to take from the other. Meaning, if Bezin were to step back and watch the case, one person will be grabbing from the other. That's Bezin watching a Vadai Maisa Zeve. Now let's stop there and make a deal. It sounds like from Rabbeinu Tam that he holds Ochsen shiny. He feels the need to explain why Shnaim Ochsen is different. That's mashma that were Shnaim Ochsen to not have this particular prat of Shnaim Ochzakin bo, we would have ideally said called Olam Gvar. So that takes us back to our question of Rav Elchanan on the Rosh. It's true. Let's say that called Olam Gvar is a siluk. However, it seems like from other Rishonim, let's say it's a siluk, but we could still say it as an ideal birur. Just because it's a siluk, that doesn't mean we shouldn't say it ever. It's a good birur. I think we could be medayik from the Rosh in Bava Metzia and Siman Aleph that he holds Davka not like this Tosfos, and that's going to answer up Rav Elchanan's question. The Rosh in Bava Metzia and Siman Aleph asks a similar question to Tosfos in Bava Basra, and he answers with the exact opposite nusach. He says, right, he asks a question. He explains the chiluk between called Olam Gvar and Shnaim Ochsen as follows. The called alim, the called davar. 1 second. Yeah, it's like 5 or 6 lines into the rush, right after he brings up the question and brings the Gemara and Lamed Daled on the base. He says, "Dehassam shiny." The Gemara and Lamed Daled on the base in Baba Basra is different than the case of Shnai Mochsim. She'ein echad mehem muchsak b'davar shema'aron alav. Nobody there is a muchsak in the thing that they're arguing over. Ve'ein bezdin mechuyavin limchos l'misha bal likach davar she'ein anu yodin shel mihu. Vehu omor shalohu. Bez does not have to get involved in something that they don't know who the item belongs to. Hilkach ein roy lifsok lahen din chaluka shemanafsi la'echad mehem shelo kedin. It sounds like the way that the Rush is explaining is that kol alim gvar is not actually not actually the ideal. In an ideal world, we would have paskin yachloku. However, kol alim gvar is different, and since kol alim gvar is different, only when we have this case where shneim ein muchzakim bo. In every other case, ideally, when there's an other possible birur, we would say a yachloku or a shuda or a birur of a psak. And with that, we can answer up Rav Elchanan's kasha. That it's true that we would say in general, if you say that the Rush holds that kol dam gvar is a psak with svaras, then it has a good umdina. That just like we say kol dam gvar and ikal meikam aladim milsa, we should also say in lekal meikam aladim milsa. But we saw from the Rosh Hashanah Fakir that really kol dam gvar is not a psak. Kol dam gvar is a siluk, and since it's a siluk, like we saw from the Rush in Bava Metzia and Halachos, that since it's a siluk, we don't want to paskin that any place where we do not have to. That's basically the mahalach that we're holding by. To point out a few kashas on the mahalach, we'll probably end up leaving these b'tzarach in. There are a few lashonos in the Rosh and Shuva which have to be worked on in this mahalach. The Rosh and Shuva, a little bit after, says stam v'samchu chachamim al zeh ki oso she'amamot shelo yasim nafsho bekapo lihilachim shelo yigzol acher mamono, seemingly bringing up svaros without any mentioning of the din of a muchzak, which is how he wants to explain the Rush and halacha. It sounds like from the lashon of the Rush, he's using a svar to explain the whole din of kol alim gvar. And later on in the tshuva, he says a lashon of v'samchu ktsas al svar shekasafti la'el. They relied a little bit on the svara for that which we said above. So there are a number of ways you could explain that. The first way, which would fit with the mahalach, is when he says that is the Rush is trying to say that it's referencing the din of muchzakus, meaning within the realm of kol alim gvar, there was one halacha that they relied on the svaras of kol alim gvar to paskin. It's not so mistaber. It will be a little ikar chasim and safer to say such a thing. Another possible way to be miyashiv it within the mahalach would be to say that it's true that a svara is not necessary to say a siluk of kol alim gvar, like we proved from the Tosar Rash and Bava Metzia. However, once you have a svara and you're already using it for something in the halacha, the haim to make a muchzak out of the first guy who's typhus from kol alim gvar, so okay, sit back and use that svara also when you do the siluk. It can't hurt to have a svara on your side when you're doing the siluk. So maybe you could read the samchu ktsas like that. It's better than the first mahalach, but also not galal. The other mahalach, which would create even bigger problems, is to just undo the entire thing that we've said for the last 35 minutes on his head and be medayik from over there that the Rush actually holds that you need svaros to do a siluk, which would come out that you have to re-explain the Rush in Tosas Bava Metzia and to re-explain the Rush earlier in Shuva who says that it's a siluk. And because of those two other lavdavkas that would create, it's not so mistaber to say that that's the mahalach. So for me personally, I think it's more shaykh to go with one of the first two reads in those two lines, even though they definitely have their difficulties. Shkoyach to everybody who listened. And I greatly appreciate all of you taking the time to listen. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions and to reach out to me about giving chaburas in the future. Have a great Shabbos.